Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Hulu review, and today I'm going to be talking about White Men Can't Jump. White Men Can't Jump is a remake of the 1992 film of the same name, and tells the story of Kamal and Jeremy, a pair of basketball players who cross paths with each other. The former is a former pro player who was forced to abandon the game after committing a crime, while the latter is hampered in his ability to play on account of injuries to his legs. Though the two get off to a rocky start, they eventually join forces so that they can hustle cash out of unsuspecting players. This leads them to work their way up the ranks as they vie to compete in a tournament with a huge amount of prize money that will change their lives forever. I made sure to watch the previous version before this one, and I can safely say the original is far superior. There is nothing about this remake that is even remotely at the same level as the original, between the bad comedy, bland characters, and what I personally feel is a complete misunderstanding of the message behind the original. To start, the characters this time around just aren't all that riveting. Kamal has a decent enough backstory as a guy who's trying to get out of his less than ideal life circumstances so that he can provide for his girlfriend and son, but that's pretty much all there is to him. I wasn't a fan of how angry and reactionary he was toward others, even as the movie progressed toward the end. Even with the angle behind his father who's sick with multiple sclerosis, he kept shooting himself in the foot in his interactions with others and never really learned his lesson from his past mistakes, so I had a hard time connecting with him. Meanwhile, Jeremy is more of a comic relief character compared to Kamal, which is okay for the sake of varying the scenes between the two leads, except his jokes are painful to listen to. A lot of them stem from his background as a so-called health guru, and it was frustrating over how much the movie relied on this concept. The only time he shows depth is with regards to his relationship with his girlfriend, and even that is done poorly. Not only is it pretty much the same as it is with Kamal and his girlfriend, but Jeremy comes off as an immature brat whenever he's around her, going so far as to say she's wasting her talent as a choreographer teaching dance classes when he himself admits he's essentially a deadbeat. These characters are lame enough by themselves, but they get even worse when they're paired together. The chemistry between the two leads just isn't the same compared to the original, and a lot of that is because it's not even the same story. The characters in this movie are similar to the original only as far as the color of their skin goes, with everything else being completely different. Kamal and Jeremy are so predictable in how they develop their relationship with each other, whereas in the original, Billy and Sydney's relationship was much more multi-layered and complex. One of the things that made the original so great was the way in which trust built between the two, and that the audience was never really sure of the main characters standing with each other until the very end on account of how much they were hustling. They could hustle other characters in their games, but there were also times where they hustled each other. There was a sort of ebb and flow to how Billy and Sydney balanced things between each other, and this made their growing friendship much more interesting. Here, however, I never got a clear understanding as to how Kamal and Jeremy became friendly or why they were bothering to hustle, because the movie gets so caught up in their dramatic backstories. There's nothing wrong with characters having depth, in fact it's a good thing, but I personally found they had too much of it in this movie. There are times when the movie becomes a full-blown drama over how depressing Kamal and Jeremy's circumstances are, to the point where I was like, okay, is this supposed to be a comedy or what? The original was far superior in how it addressed the inner conflicts of its characters, because despite the problems they face, they always found a way to bounce back and become motivated again. But in this remake, despite how seemingly straightforward their journey is, Kamal and Jeremy's arcs feel overcomplicated, depressing, and lack any sort of intrigue. And again, the whole hustling system just doesn't make any sense. The pair hustle a couple games, sure, but it all feels directionless, like it's not building toward anything specific. Even with the big tournament that eventually comes, its impact feels mundane, because at that point it becomes another bog-standard rags to riches story. Once again, the original did a much better job with this idea. Billy and Sydney had to scramble for any amount of money they could to get by. Even something as relatively meager as a couple $1,000s is a game changer for those two, and seeing them struggle for this modest amount made them a lot more relatable, whereas in this movie I was just like, yeah, $500,000 is cool and all, but The biggest problem I had with this movie though, and I hope I don't sound too controversial when I say this, is the way it addresses race relations between the characters. Simply put, this movie is not subtle at all with how it demonstrates the nuances between black and white, and I don't mean that in a good way. It constantly goes out of its way to highlight the races of the characters, with racial jabs being exchanged between Kamal's friends and Jeremy to the point where it gets ridiculous. The divisiveness between the characters never really improves over the course of the story, and gives a mean-spirited vibe throughout the whole movie that makes it uncomfortable to watch. Again, I don't mean to keep comparing it with the original, but this is something that was done much better in the 1992 version. Of course, the differences between Sydney and Billy were addressed, but it felt much more subtle and downplayed, and had more to do with who they were as people instead of the color of their skin. Moreover, the original placed more of an emphasis on Billy being the main character instead of Sydney, which ties into the central theme the original had going for it, and that a book should never be judged by its cover. It takes a sport predominantly identified with black culture, connects it to a white character, and shows how perceptions change as a result. By comparison, the remake does virtually nothing to address any sort of racial goodwill between any of the characters and doesn't properly address the subject matter of its title. The fact that they took Billy and literally made him unable to jump is an insult to the intellectual thought put into the original movie and its themes. The racial aspect is so watered down in this remake, it feels like a joke. This leads me to talk about the comedy, and honestly, there's not much to say about it. The movie simply just isn't funny, with its overt racial jokes becoming increasingly more cringeworthy over time. The fact that Kamal and Jeremy debate about whether Paul Thomas Anderson or Spike Lee is the best film director might be one of the most pointless lines of dialogue I've heard in a comedy in my life. Lots of product placement is used throughout the dialogue as well that only serve to reinforce racial stereotypes instead of breaking them, and the movie features an odd amount of slapstick too. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw someone use a flamethrower in this movie. A freaking flamethrower, like what? Once more, the original was so much funnier compared to the remake, largely thanks to the trash talk the characters exchanged. The banter they shared was so authentic and realistic, it never felt like they were actors reading a script, whereas in the remake, everyone sounds so phony with how poetic they are and trying to insult each other. Beyond this, though, the original had a lot of little character moments that just contributed to the fun vibe of the story, whether it involves antics that take place on the court, or Gloria's obsession with being a contestant on Jeopardy. All these little things further bring the story to life, as well as being a lot of fun to watch, but this movie just doesn't have those moments. The basketball scenes are one of the few things this movie does an okay job at, though it's not perfect. The choreography of the players looks good, and some of the shots are well framed, but other times the editing makes it hard to see what's happening, and the amount of slow-mo featured in them is pretty distracting to say the least. In the original, it was much easier to see what was happening on screen, and again, it felt more authentic seeing the actors play. The shots players made were suspenseful, because the camera would be framed in such a way to keep the audience guessing as to whether a ball would land or not, and the remake doesn't really have this novelty. Another thing I sort of like about the remake is the visual aesthetics. The different areas of Venice Beach and Los Angeles in general are still appealing and have a modern look to them, which makes sense because it is a modern movie, but even so, I still can't help but feel disappointed by them. The original felt a lot more grounded in how it showed the impoverished neighborhoods where characters lived, with Billy in particular being forced to jump from one dive to the next in an effort to stay afloat. This ragtag kind of lifestyle contributed to everything else in the movie to make the characters more sympathetic, while the remake just looks flashy for the sake of being flashy. I just don't understand how a movie like this can claim to be a remake and yet stray so far from what the original set out to accomplish. It does try to lift individual moments from the original, like Jeremy's girlfriend sitting on his lap while he drives, in the same way Gloria does with Billy, but these moments come off as half-hearted in their execution. And the new plot threads it does throw in mostly end up going nowhere. Jeremy is supposed to have some sort of drug addiction affecting his ability to be productive, but it never really gets addressed or resolved. And the way they handled Kamal's father's illness was so lazy, even the characters themselves don't care about it by the end. This remake has little to no reason to exist. I can understand the idea behind updating a movie for modern audiences to enjoy, but to put such little effort in recreating its themes and characters in at least a somewhat novel way makes this remake all the more tragic. Overall, White Man Can't Jump is a shameless attempt to rehash the original it's based on without putting deeper thought into what made it work in the first place. If you like the original 1992 movie and are curious to see a more modern take, just do yourself a favor and avoid this. Everything that the original did is better than this remake and is still relevant today. Bad comedy, boring characters, divisive presentation, and a misunderstanding of the source material contribute to making this one of the most pointless remakes I've ever seen. The movie can't even stand on its own legs, much less jump for the lofty expectations that it can hope to surpass. What did you think about this movie? Did you hate it as much as I did, or did you find some redeeming factors to it? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of White Men Can't Jump. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part where next time I review the German comedy Hard Feelings. Bye bye!